Welcome. This is David Boles, Human Meme. Today's topic, renewal, starting over, forgiveness. We wonder who we are, and we are always thinking of ways for unbecoming our unbecoming behavior. We're all guilty of the inappropriate crass comment or the misunderstood facial expression or gesture. Sometimes we purposefully set out to hurt someone, just for the hunt of the emotional experience. Some of us spend a lot of time apologizing for our behavior, and yet, like the Mobius strip before us, we do it again and again and again, and how can we get out of the apology and start getting into renewal and starting over and even tempting forgiveness? All relationships are difficult, and they take a lot of hard work. There's always a power struggle between dominant personalities, and that's why a strong personality mixing with a more laid-back personality often works better. Some people like to make decisions, and others don't mind letting decisions be made on their behalf. But what happens if two dominant personalities meet head-to-head in a personal relationship or in a work scenario? How does the negotiation process move forward? Often, it does not. It just fails. I am reminded of a viral letter that went wild on the internet about a year ago. 3 young women were about to start a college career, and strangers as they were also going to be roommates in a dorm room. One of the young women demanded via an email blast that she have this bed and those 2 closets and that desk directly under the window. The other 2 students, replying to her email, said, "Let's wait until we're all together in the same room and we can decide who sleeps where and the rest of the who and the how." Well, the other young woman was having none of that. She was entitled to choose everything she wanted because she wanted it. And, she threatened, if she found anyone or any things in the spaces she reserved, they would be tossed out the window. When one of the 2 young women released the first young woman's screaming email on the internet, the first woman was shamed in public, and she backed off and apologized and agreed to the negotiation route. Now, I ask you here, if that public shaming and humiliation hadn't happened and led to that forced apology, what would have really happened? Yes, of course, we both know what would have happened. Upon arrival, the first woman would have tossed everything out the window into the courtyard. So we're only sorry if we get caught. And we rarely confess our sins to those we've directly sinned against. And that is wrong in the complete. The art of the apology is something special. I'm sure you know a professional apologizer in your life who not only accepts fault, but the fault of the world. And on the other end of that same piece of string, you have an apologist who is quickly able to turn around the blame for anything and everything on other people. Both of those bits of string are not quite on the scale of average reactions. Apologies should be genuine and quiet and heartfelt and intimate. So what is the right and proper way to seek renewal and forgiveness in a relationship? Words are cheap weapons. You can use them to try to set things right. But the only thing that matters in the long run is behavioral changes. And so I am reminded of two Marshall Jamison stories I have probably shared with you before here in pieces in this Human Meme podcast, and probably also in a bolesblogs.com article or two. Marshall Jamison was a Nebraska mentor of mine. He worked on Broadway. He was an actor, a director, writer, producer. And Marshall created many shows for the Mark Twain film series on the public broadcasting system. Marshall invented Anyone for Tennyson and moved to Lincoln, Nebraska to work for the Nebraska Educational Television Network as a producer, and to finish the end of a fine career by working for a regional PBS powerhouse where Marshall could quickly green-light his own productions and get them done. One day, Marshall was on set, directing a live show located in an auditorium. There were fancy lighting technicians flown in from New York to help get the right look. One of the grips, a grip is a guy who sets the lights, was yelling at Marshall's local Nebraska crew. And Nebraska crews are notoriously friendly and safe. And Marshall took that New Yorker into a corner and privately said, in his big, deep Amherst voice, with his 6'6" frame towering over the fellow,
"If you ever talk to one of my guys like that again, you'll have me to deal with. Got it?"
The New York lighting guy shrunk back and said, "Sure, sure." And for the rest of the afternoon, that New York guy was Nebraska friendly. And Marshall Jamison hated him for it, and later called him the definition of a bastard. Because Marshall said that guy had a choice to make. He could be nice, or he could be an a-hole. And he chose a-hole, when he just as easily could have gone the other way. Marshall said he would have had more respect for the guy if he kept screaming at the crew, but trying to be quieter. Because then Marshall reasoned, that's who the guy really was, and he couldn't change. And you really can't blame someone for who they are. The second Marshall Jamison story has to deal with the great character actor Burgess Meredith. Burgess Meredith had a long career in film and television and is probably best known for playing the Penguin in the 1960s Batman television series. So Marshall Jamison was a young kid in New York City, and he saw Burgess Meredith on the live stage on Broadway. Marshall was mesmerized by the performance. And back in the 1930s and 40s, you could line up backstage, usually in the alley, at a Broadway show and actually meet and greet the stars for a while. They'd sit there and talk to you. That's how it was done. Intimate stuff done right. That was the live theater in New York City. Well, that night at the theater, Marshall decided to be more formal and more direct. He sent a handwritten note backstage to Burgess Meredith, identifying himself as a young actor, and he would just love to meet him and shake his hand. The reply quickly came back from the doorman of the theater, who told Marshall to get lost because Burgess Meredith wasn't interested in shaking his hand or any other part of his body. Marshall walked away humiliated and hurt. Then, decades later, when Marshall was directing and producing the very successful television series Anyone for Tennyson on PBS, Burgess Meredith wanted to make a debut on the show by reading some of his poetry. Now, by that time, the halcyon days of the Batman TV series had long faded, and Burgess Meredith was old, famous, but really sort of a nobody. But because he was someone, and he did have a name, Marshall was smart enough to know Burgess Meredith would bring some recognition to his show, even though his star had fallen. And so Marshall Jamison offered Burgess Meredith $2,500 to appear on the show. And that was exactly half of what other guest stars received. And Marshall knew Burgess would take the money and run, because Burgess was living on the poverty line. And Marshall was right. Burgess Meredith took the money, did the show, was spectacular. Now, even more decades later, in retrospect, both Marshall and Burgess are dead and gone. Was Marshall Jamison being a bastard to Burgess Meredith by cutting the standard payment in half to prove the point of a wounded boy years later? Or was Marshall merely playing the game that Burgess Meredith himself had set out on the table when Marshall wanted to meet him backstage on Broadway? Who gets the blame? Which one of them is owed an apology? Thank you for listening. Be a human meme.